We're back with you tonight on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. Recently elected EFF student command leader has outlined a vision that will impact the focus of student politics during his term of office. Sihle Lonzi says the EFF students would set up associate structures within schools so that students would not fall victim to those he called political hustlers and swindlers who are using students to gain political positions within the ruling African National Congress. Lonzi was elected EFF Student Command President in late July this year at the organization's national conference. He joins us now to explain his vision for student politics. Good to have you with us, and thank you very much for your time. Why do you say student politics have been infiltrated by swindlers? Sihle, who are the swindlers?
No, thank you very much for having us, and thank you to your viewers. No, I think generally the students of South Africa, together with the youth, can all agree that there's been a general degeneration on student and youth activism in South Africa. And this is precisely because the student and youth structures which are aligned to the governing party, which is the African National Congress, have used student politics and youth politics as a way to advance their own selfish and individualistic careers and very consumerist and materialist standards. So that has been what has led to really the decline at a national level. So part of the very important role of the EFF Students Command is to revive not only student activism but youth activism in South Africa, because there is currently no voice of youth and young people in South Africa. Those who are in the governing party have been consumed by the factional fights and factional battles of the African National Congress, and they've forgotten about the youth of South Africa. And even with the bodies that are there, if you look at the NYDA, I mean, the NYDA pays itself more than 50% of the budget on salaries. I mean, that's despicable for any developing nation, for a body which is designed to look at issues that affect youth, particularly small businesses, particularly the questions of unemployment, and also assisting young people within our communities to build opportunities. But you have that structure spending more than 50% of its budget on paying themselves. So
I won't debate the numbers. I'm not sure if they do spend more than 50%, but I'll take your word for it. But I'm sure they'll come and argue that that in itself is actually employing young people within those structures to work and serve in communities. But I'm not here to argue for it. That's what they would say. But let's talk about this issue that you are raising of whether youth activism is dead. So in June Youth Month, we invited a lot of young people here to come and talk to us about precisely that. Is youth activism actually dead? And they are contending that that's not true. In fact, what they're challenging is that organizations like the ANC, COSAS, EFF, Student Command, and so on and so forth, are not awakened to the fact that young people no longer see political parties as vehicles for their activism. Because they've got other platforms where their activism is even louder, social media, and they run their own kind of activism in those spaces without being inside any political organization. So it's not correct to say the activism is dead. It's just the activism is no longer being expressed inside formations called political parties.
Look, I don't think there is any evidence which points to the fact that the youth of South Africa, perhaps definitely with the ANC.
Must Fall is one.
Definitely with the ANC and the Youth League. I don't see any young person who's sensible enough who'd want to take part in those organizations. But if you look at the way...
Peace Must Fall is one. The other one is the
No, but if you look at the wave of the institutions of higher learning
campaign,
those are primarily EFF Students Command-led institutions at a large scale. Now, the responsibility we then now have as the EFF Students Command is to say, how do we convert the popularity and vibrancy that we have in institutions of higher learning? I mean, you look at the recent victories, I mean, the margins in the University of Limpopo, you look at many other institutions, in KZN in particular, the EFF Students Command has been taking over, particularly in your TVET colleges. So there is a wave which has existed primarily there. What the EFF Students Command has been unable to do in the past, which we are deliberately doing now, is to say that how do we convert our SRC victories, how do we convert our vibrancy within the higher education space into the electoral growth of South Africa? Look, the reality that young people must come to accept in South Africa is that we may be very well, involved on your day-to-day in our communities, but who leads South Africa has a direct impact on our lives as the youth of this country. So it's not good enough for me as Sihle to say, look, in Gugulethu, I've got, an NPO going, I go and I assist people to apply to UCT and all of that. That is important work. But we must then extend that to say we must also be concerned about who governs South Africa. So the shocking numbers of youth and students who are not registered to vote, that must then be where we then take our activism to say, how do we translate this activism that you speak about into who forms part of the legislative bodies of South Africa?
But is that not a challenge for you to say, how do you make political formations like the EFF Student Command or the EFF in general attractive to those young people who are looking and saying, I don't even want to go and register because none of these political vehicles actually do it for me. I can just do my hashtag campaign and be successful at it, and at least I'm doing something on the ground that immediately impacts the community.
Look, the most immediate thing we are engaged in. So one of the important resolutions which came out of the 4th National Students' Assembly, which is our idea of a conference, and so we call them assemblies, is that for someone to be a member of the EFF Students' Command, they have to be a member of the EFF, and they must be registered to vote with the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa. So we are first looking inward to say that how many of our members, students, are actually registered to vote. And of course, we had made the reflection that before this, the numbers were quite low because students tended to view student issues as though they were an island which is detached from the political environment of South Africa. But what students are now coming to realize is that if you want free education, if you want accommodation, if you want infrastructure development in the TVET sector, then you must be concerned about who is presiding over the Department of Higher Education, for example. So part of what we're then doing is that we must convert that vibrancy. So every Friday we're engaged in what we have called the hashtag Votamtomcha campaign. So the sole mandate of that campaign is to say that every Friday all structures of the EFF Students' Command across the country must be engaged in a program to ensure that students are registered to vote. Because what we found in the local government elections, that is why I'm not very persuaded that young people generally don't want to vote. But perhaps there is a voter education that must be at play, and also we must play the role to bring them to the party. Because what we discovered in the local government elections was actually on the day of voting, there was quite a number of young people who were keen to go. I mean, it's a public holiday, they've got nothing else to do. But what we saw is that when they arrived in the voting district, they were not registered to vote. So we must win the fight at a level of registration. So we are already looking at 2024, long before all these other organizations are looking at it.
Before we get to 2024, let's talk about who occupies the political office of basic education. We particularly want to mobilize young people against that individual. Why?
Look, Bongingosi Emmanuel Nzimande calls himself Blade for whatever reasons, because he's not that very sharp. He has failed the Department of Higher Education on many occasions. And I think South Africans must start to ask themselves, why is there an over-enthusiasm from Emmanuel Nzimande to be Minister of Higher Education? Like, I mean, if you actually think about it, most ministers of the ANC are almost rotated around in a variety of departments at a very arbitrary, factional way whenever someone new comes in. But he's been quite very enthusiastic and keen to just remain and almost run the higher education space as though it is some, royal arrangement and he's the only one entitled to ever be Minister of Higher Education. So let's take, for example, what happens today in Parliament. So in Parliament today, and the EFF expressed this in the statement, I think it's also been reflected in multiple news outlets. Bongingosi Emmanuel Nzimande wants to keep a report which is looking into corruption in the National Skills Fund confidential. Now, why would any, minister, why would any public official want to hide a report that shows the people of South Africa the corruption that is happening within the National Skills Fund? And the National Skills Fund becomes an integral structure, because you would know that South Africa is currently having a skills crisis.
Yeah.
So South Africa cannot respond to the demands of the labor market, cannot respond to even the global demands in terms of the standards of the market, what is required. Yeah. So to have a country which is currently having a skills shortage, also admitted by Emmanuel, but at the same time he then goes to Parliament and says, I want to hide a forensic report which is looking into corruption which is happening here. For what reason? I mean, the AG, I think in the financial year 2019 to 2020, classified the audit of that particular fund. I think they call it a disclaimer. Now, if you've read much on audit, you know that a disclaimer is probably one of the worst things that they can ever give you in an audit, outcome, because it practically says you have given us nothing to work with for us to know what it is that you do with your budget. So she said there's about well over 5 billion rands that is unaccounted for in a national skills fund in a country that is currently having a skills shortage. So that says to us, number one, not only is he incompetent, but number two, this fellow may actually be extremely corrupt. Yeah. Because if he tries to hide it, maybe, he may be conflicted, or he may be part of the names which are there.
So let's talk a little bit about this question of skills shortage. Yeah. In fact, we just had that conversation moments ago with some of the organization stakeholders, SGBs, NEPTOSA, and so on and so forth. NG Motsega's department has decided that grade 10 to 12 will get additional 38 subjects to deal with this question of skills. What do you make of that approach that they're taking? These are going to be occupational and vocational subjects.
Look, I think the ANC generally is an organization that is ran out of ideas. And perhaps if we were to be, nice to them, I think they're just old. I mean, Angie Motsega has been also another one who's been holding on to the basic education department for an extremely long time. And there's been absolutely no progress in that space. So the ANC, the schooling system in South Africa has a crisis of infrastructure. So by infrastructure, I mean, textbooks, buildings, tools, learning material, not only schools, but also if you look at your TVET sector and most historically black institutions of higher learning universities. Yeah. So the ANC doesn't seem to have a structural consciousness of what is the problem that, plague South Africa. And they express this in many of their other policy positions. I mean, they'll go austerity, they'll go budget cuts, and many other things that don't deal with the structural issues. South African schools have an infrastructure problem. We can add 30, 50, 40, 100. We can even go to China and say, give us a curriculum. But if there's no textbook in the classroom, then what is there? What are we going to learn?
So you are saying they will be not teaching hairdressing, robotics, programming and that type of thing, because, I mean, we don't have a simple thing, it's just a textbook.
They don't have a textbook, they don't have boards, some of them don't have classrooms, they can't even build a basic toilet in a primary school. So how are they going to be able to do all of the things if they don't want to resolve the deep structural problems, particularly with our schools in your rural and township areas? So that is what the ANC has been failing to deal with, and they try and come, I mean, just a while ago, there was a craze over the fourth IR. Yeah. Let's give students laptops. Let's give them iPads. I mean, you give them iPads in a township environment where, the mother is unemployed, where perhaps some of the siblings are either, drug and alcohol abuse. You give a kid an iPad, within a week it's lost because you don't have a structural understanding of what are the challenges which are affecting South Africa. So the ANC has no solution for higher education or basic education in South Africa.
How is your reforming of the student politics going to address those issues? What is your vision? Tell me one, two things that you say you will do.
So one of the most important things, and perhaps, I mean, it's obviously quite a broad idea, but from time to time, the EFF Students Command will be able to communicate this through their programs. So what we've realized and what we've diagnosed is that student politics, like I said when I started, has tried to almost create this island for themselves. So students were unable to, realize and appreciate that, for example, you cannot speak about accommodation if you don't speak about the land question in South Africa. You cannot speak about funding if you cannot speak about who owns the economic heights and big industries in South Africa. Because free education, although it must be free for the user, but it must be funded from somewhere. There must be textbooks, there must be lecturers must be paid and all of that. So part of what we want to do, we want to then close the gap between student and community struggles within our country. That's why part of our taglines, hashtag is that student wars are community wars. And this is not necessarily a new idea. If you look at the Black Consciousness generation, if you look at the 76 generation, if you look at the likes of Tiro, they understood that you cannot divorce the troubles of campus from the political environment and landscape of South Africa. So we must begin to be like the 76 generation to say, let us not only take the fight to the vice-chancellors within the universities. Yes, we must take it to them, but let us also take it to the streets of South Africa. So it's to bridge that gap between, a student and a member of the community within society.
Yeah. You've got a new party that's coming, I think it's called Build One South Africa. It's going to be led by the previous leader of the Democratic Alliance, Msimamani. He says one of his big visions is to have create employment for every household in South Africa. You're saying all job seekers must be given at least 2,000 rands allowance to go and find work. How are their approaches different?
It's an extremely scientific and evidence-based demand that the EFF Students Command is making. If you look at studies, it says that on average it costs whether you are a graduate or you're looking for a job, on average it costs you about 1,000 rand per month to look for a job. So you must print your CV, that costs money. You must take a taxi to interviews. This interview is going to reject you. Tomorrow you must wake up, you must repeat. So that entire process, studies have shown that it costs about 1,000 rand. Now, they go further to say that most unemployed graduates, or rather most unemployed youth, have to choose between a taxi fare to an interview and buying bread to eat. Now, you don't want to be a society that creates a trade-off over, eating and being able to go and seek livelihood. So the EFF Students Command then says, every job seeker, of course there will be a process. It's not going to be a Wally just hand out 2,000 rand to everyone. There will be a process to say, from time to time, job seekers must come to that particular agency or whatever department can call to show that these are the steps we've taken. I've gone to this number of interviews. I've been here. I've been accepted here. It also assists the government to be able to track the level of, participation in the labor economy of the young people. But we go beyond because of that trade-off to say, let us at least come up with an amount of 2,000 rand. Look, we're not married to that amount, but we're beginning the discussion. If there's someone who can come with other evidence-based things to either increase or decreases within reason, we are happy to accept that. But we're saying there must not be a trade-off between putting food on the table and looking for a job.
Social development is coming up, not exactly that, but something to that effect with the 350 social relief of distress grant to say it can't be a grant in perpetuity. So you've got to come up and be part of a database that at least tells us that you are looking for work. Otherwise, we will be, of course, sending you to places where you could possibly be finding work. But you need to be in a space where either you're being equipped with skills or you are actively finding employment, not just sitting and waiting for the 350.
Look, in principle, we totally agree with that. But we totally reject and disagree with 350 rand. So there is no evidence. So I don't understand this problem of doing a study to find out how do we solve this problem and then prescribing a solution that is totally divorced from what you're engaged in. So you can't say to the youth of South Africa that on average it's going to cost you 1,000 rand to look for a job and then come back to say, but we're going to give you 350. I mean, what problem are you solving? So we are open to the idea of young people from time to time reporting to whatever agency to say, these are the strands that I've taken, these are the lengths that I've gone to seek for a job so that we can sustain the job-seeking allowance. It's not South Africa. It wouldn't be a new thing in South Africa. There are many other, formerly developing and now developed nations which have actually done a lot of work on job-seeking allowance. Even internally within our country, many research groups have been doing work on job-seeking allowances.
Yeah. You touched on this a little bit, and I want you to expand on it. Are you saying that South Africa is falling into the global peer pressure when we are saying we are pursuing the 4IR revolution?
Totally. And I don't know, and this is a problem with the government that has run out of ideas. Because if I were to just pause the 4th IR debate for a minute and go to the energy debate, now you find the president of South Africa, the ANC, running behind the West, seeking the decommissioning of coal plants in South Africa. Because there seems to be this pressure and wave that now we're all going green and all of that. But then if you look at how much our economy is still very much reliant on coal, you ask yourself, why would any legislator want to rush to an energy supply solution of a developed nation without having gone through? And what's even funny is that many of the developed nations themselves actually went through the phase that South Africa is currently being in. So the ANC is an organization that wants to piggyback on global trends, particularly at the policy level. It's unable to intrinsically come up with decisive, policy positions that are there to grow South Africa. So the same applies with the 4th Industrial Revolution. You can't just be excited to hand out iPads just because you watch CNN and you see people being given iPads. You ought to ask yourself, do the schools where we're going to be handing out these things, do they have the infrastructure? Is the network? I mean, just this past weekend, I was in Umhlabelingana for the Heritage Day rally of the EFF. And one of the major problems there, even when I was engaging with some of the learners, was network. So it means that you must be able to then build the necessary infrastructure that will create the conditions which are necessary for an industrial revolution of any kind to take place. But
Newzroom will tell you that, that revolution of our education will not be delayed. Doesn't mean that if there's no network, we mustn't at least begin to have smart boards. If network is still behind, it will find us on the way, but it must at least be moving in that direction.
The problem with what that is going to create, which is currently what is happening in South Africa, is a two-tier education system. So in South Africa, you will know that there are schools which are well-resourced, which will have those boards. I can tell you now, even himself, if he's honest to himself, he will be able to appreciate that all of those boards he's talking about are only going to be enjoyed by a type of school which serves a particular minority group in society. There is no way he's going to put those things in rural communities. There's no way he's going to put them in townships because there is not even a classroom to begin with. So you want a government that is able to think about problems at a structural level and not want to put on tape over a wound that you have not really done the work to fix.
Sihle, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing some of your ideas with us. CFF Student Command Leader there, Sihle Lonzi, incoming, and some of the views that he shares on what needs to happen to revolutionize student politics.